The valley had no name on any human map. That was the point. Vora had scratched the namelessness into a stone tablet herself, 43 years ago, when she'd carried Mitha on her back through the last mountain pass and decided that the world could forget them if it liked. She'd decided it first. It was easier that way. The valley sat between two ridges of gray basalt, narrow enough that full sunlight only reached the floor for about 4 hours each afternoon, and even then it arrived sideways, amber and exhausted, like a man who'd walked too far. A stream ran through it. Black-trunked birch trees clustered at the western end. The grass was thick and damp and smelled of iron, and in the mornings a mist rolled in off the ridge that was so dense Vora could press her hand into it and feel the cold sitting on her skin like a second skin. She liked it. She'd always liked cold. She was crouched in the stream now, both boots off, feet in the water up to the ankle, turning over flat stones to check for the gray crayfish that sometimes sheltered underneath. Her hands were large, everything about her was large, and the knuckles were scarred and the skin over them was the color of old bark, a dark greenish-brown that shifted depending on the light. Her jaw jutted. Her brow ridge ran like a shelf of bone above eyes that were very dark and very still, the kind of eyes that registered everything and gave nothing back. Her teeth, when she opened her mouth, were not delicate things. The lower canines curved slightly upward. She was what she was. She'd stopped naming it decades ago. Behind her, up the slope, the cottage made its small sounds. Wood settling. The high, thin complaint of the kettle coming to heat. The slow shuffle of Mitha moving from the stove to the window, which she did every morning at this hour because she liked to look at the birch trees when the mist was in them, and Vora had never once told her not to. Mitha was not orc. Mitha was human, and old and small in the way that old humans got small, not withered exactly but concentrated, as if everything unnecessary had burned away over the years and what remained was just the essential part of her, all the weight converted into density. She had white hair she kept plaited and eyes the color of the stream in winter, very pale and very clear. She had laugh lines so deep they'd become structural. She had a way of pouring tea that suggested she had once been shown the correct way and had never seen any reason to deviate from it since. She'd been 17 when they'd found each other. Vora had been running. That was the whole story, really. Vora had been running from the end of a war, and Mitha had been the farmer's daughter who'd hidden her in a root cellar for 3 days with nothing but dried beans and a wool blanket, and something about those 3 days had crystallized into the 43 years that followed. Vora had never fully understood what Mitha had seen in her. She'd stopped trying to understand it and started just accepting it, which was the closest thing to peace she'd ever found. She found a crayfish, held it up. It was small and indignant and waved its claws at the sky. "Too small," she said and set it back. The stones in the stream were smooth and cold, and the water ran over her feet with a pressure she could feel in the joints of her ankles. She stayed there a while longer than she needed to. This was one of the things she did lingered in physical sensation, because it was honest and didn't ask anything of her. The water was water. It had no opinions about her face. She was walking back up the slope, boots in hand, when she heard the sound. Feet, many of them on the far ridge trail. She stopped walking. Her head came up. The feet were booted and they were trying to be quiet, which meant they knew the value of quiet, which meant they were either hunters or soldiers. The weight distribution said soldiers. The spacing said a column of at least 8. She stood very still for a long moment and listened to the approach. Then she put her boots back on, tied them carefully, and went inside. The cottage was 2 rooms and a loft. Mitha had furnished it over the years with a stubbornness that Vora found both baffling and comforting. The hand-woven rugs, the shelf of ceramic mugs she traded for at the market in Coldbreak every autumn, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams in tight bundles that filled the whole space with the smell of thyme, and something Vora didn't have a name for that was just the smell of Mitha. the smell of a specific human woman being consistently alive in a specific space for decades. Mitha was at the table with her tea. She looked up when Vora came in. "Company," Vora said. Mitha set her mug down. Just that, she set it down, with the particular deliberateness she used when she was deciding something. Then she looked at Vora with those pale, clear eyes, and what passed between them was not words. It was 43 years of parsing each other. It was a conversation that had been rehearsed so many times it no longer needed to be spoken. "How many?" Mitha asked. 8, maybe 10, soldiers. Human soldiers. Is there another kind? Mitha made a small sound that might have been amusement or might have been resignation. She picked her mug back up. "What do you want to do?" Vora stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at the room, the rugs, the mugs, the herbs, the shelf of books that Mitha had accumulated the way water accumulates in a hollow, slowly and inevitably over years. She looked at the 2 chairs by the cold hearth that had conformed over decades to the specific shapes of the 2 women who sat in them. "Let them knock," she said. They knocked. It took them a while to find the cottage. She heard them descending the ridge trail and then losing it, and then finding it again, and there was a low consultation that she couldn't quite make out, and then boots on the path, and then a fist on the door, knocking with the particular authority of someone who was used to doors opening for them. Vora sat in her chair by the cold hearth. She had her hands on her knees. She was not armed, which was a deliberate choice, and she was wearing a plain gray shirt and plain dark trousers, which was what she wore every day, and she had done nothing about her face, which was also what she did every day. She breathed, slowly and evenly, and waited. Mitha opened the door. There were 9 of them. They wore the sand-colored uniforms Vora didn't recognize, not the blue of the Confederation she'd last had dealings with, not the green and black of the border garrisons she'd avoided for 2 decades. New. The insignia on their shoulders was a rising sun over a mountain, which was either the hegemony or one of the provincial coalitions that had formed in the long, quiet years after the consolidation. She filed this information away without urgency. The one at the front was young, late 20s, probably, with a lean, angular face and the kind of posture that gets trained into a person over years and eventually becomes structural. He had a lieutenant's pins on his collar and a way of holding himself that suggested he'd been given this assignment and had decided to do it correctly, which Vora respected more than bravado. He looked past Mitha and found Vora in the chair. He went very still. This was the moment she always watched for, the one where a person's body told the truth before their face could compose a response. His hands didn't go to his weapon, which was good. His jaw tightened, which was honest. His eyes moved over her, the jaw, the brow, the hands, and she watched him do the arithmetic and arrive at a conclusion he'd probably been intellectually prepared for but emotionally wasn't. "That's her," said someone behind him quietly. The lieutenant's name, she would learn later, was Khan. Lieutenant Davar Khan, 29 years old, 3rd-generation military, assigned to the Relics Survey Unit, which was what they were apparently calling it. "Vora Greymental," he said. His voice was steady. She gave him credit for it. "Last surviving Orc of the Greythorn bloodline." "I'm aware of who I am," Vora said. "A beat. We need to speak with you. You're speaking with me now." He didn't quite smile. "I mean, may we come in?" Vora looked at Mitha, who had not moved from the doorway. Mitha had her arms folded, and her expression was one Vora had seen many times over the years, which was the expression of a small human woman who had decided that she was the most immovable object in any given situation, and was prepared to demonstrate this to anyone who needed demonstrating. "Tea?" Mitha asked the lieutenant. He blinked. Yes, thank you." They came in. Not all 9. Khan brought 2 others, a woman with a broad, square face and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent years reading field reports in bad light, his sergeant, Areth, and a young man barely out of his teens who carried a leather satchel and had the specific nervous energy of someone whose expertise was suddenly, unexpectedly relevant. The rest stayed outside, which Vora could hear them doing, the small sounds of soldiers standing at ease in unfamiliar country. Mitha made tea with the precise ritual she always brought to it, and set out 4 mugs without ceremony, and sat. The sergeant looked at the mugs, and then at the map case she'd set on the table, and then at Vora with the expression of someone recalibrating several things at once. Khan said, "I'll tell you the situation plainly." "I'd appreciate that," Vora said. He opened the map case. Inside was a document, thick paper, multiple pages, with the kind of dense institutional typeface that meant it had been written by committee. He did not make her read it. He gave her the version that mattered. 13 months ago, something had started crossing the northern passes. Not an army. Something worse than an army, which is to say something that didn't behave like an army and didn't respond to what armies respond to. The hegemony's northern garrisons had registered contact points first, isolated incidents, posts going silent, supply lines cut, and for a while the official assessment had been bandits, because bandits were the explanation that fit within the existing framework. Then the existing framework had proven inadequate, and the assessment had been upgraded. Not bandits. The young man with the satchel, his name was Kale, civilian scholar, university trained, opened the satchel and produced a drawing. It had been rendered with precision by someone with a steady hand and very bad news to deliver. Vora looked at it without expression. It was a face. Elongated skull, deep orbital ridges, joints that suggested a restructuring of the skeletal architecture she'd been taught as a child was called the second form. Bioluminescent nodules under the jaw. Eyes that were set too far apart and arranged in the visual pattern of something built for ambush. "The Veth," she said. Khan looked at her. "You know them." "I know of them." She set the drawing down on the table with the same care she'd use with anything breakable or dangerous. "They were gone when I was young. The Orc elders spoke of them the way your elders speak of things that happened before they were born, as warning, not memory. They're not gone now." "No," she said, "I can see that." Mitha had been very quiet. Now she picked up the drawing and looked at it with the frank, unfrightened assessment of someone who had spent 43 years refusing to be frightened of faces. After a moment she put it down and picked up her mug. "What do you want from her?" Mitha asked. She was not asking Khan. She was asking the room and the document and the institutional weight behind them. Khan looked at Vora. Vora Greymental was of the Greythorn bloodline, which is the only bloodline that maintained the Accord of Kelvinas. "The Accord is a myth," Vora said. "Your scholars have been saying so for 100 years. Kale cleared his throat. "Been revising that position." He pulled another document from his satchel, this one older, the paper foxed and fragile, bound with a piece of string that had been retied so many times the original knot was theoretical. The Accord wasn't a myth, it was a treaty, a specific, binding, negotiated treaty between the Orc bloodlines and the Veth, ratified in the 3rd generation after the first crossing. The Greythorn bloodline was the last signatory line. He hesitated. "You're the last Greythorn." Vora was quiet for a long moment. "The Accord is void," she said. "The bloodline ended. The bloodline's obligations ended with it." "With respect," Kale said, and his voice had the quality of someone who was about to say something they'd rehearsed. "The Accord doesn't work that way. The Accord is tied to the bloodline itself, biological, not institutional. It doesn't recognize death by attrition. The last living member of a signatory bloodline carries the full weight of the Accord until... Until what? He stopped. He looked at his document and then back at her, and there was something in his face that was not quite pity and not quite awe, and was possibly the closest an academic expression could come to grief. "Until they choose to invoke it," he said, "or choose not to." Vora asked them to leave the documents with her. She sat with them for 3 hours after the soldiers settled in the yard, and Mitha sat across from her without talking, which was a thing Mitha understood how to do perfectly, to be present in the same room as a silence without filling it, to be the specific weight of a person who loves you sitting 3 feet away while you think. Vora read the accord twice. The language was not human. It had been transcribed phonetically from Orcish and then translated, which meant the translation was wrong in several ways she could identify immediately and probably wrong in several more she'd only find if she dug. But the structure was there, underneath the bad translation. The obligations of the bloodline, the terms of engagement, the formal procedure for invocation. The invocation required a speaker. It required a speaker who stood between the Veth and the humans, in the literal geographical sense, in the passes, in the space where the two peoples would otherwise simply continue to kill each other until one side was gone. It required the speaker to name themselves, their bloodline, their accord, in the Veth's own form of recognition, which was not language exactly but was something that worked like language. It required her to walk into the passes alone. She set the documents down and looked at her hands on the table, the knuckles, the bark-dark skin, the old scars. "You read it all," Mitha said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." "What does it ask?" Vora told her. Mitha was quiet for a moment. "Then will it work?" "I don't know. But it might. It might." Mitha nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing something away to argue about later but was choosing not to argue about it yet. She picked up her mug, which had gone cold. She did not heat it back up. She just held it. "The question," Vora said, "is whether the Veth still know the accord, whether any of them are old enough to carry it, whether the institutional memory survived whatever drove them back across the passes in the first place." "How long ago was the accord signed?" 300 years, give or take." "Do the Veth live that long?" Vora turned the document over, looking at the back of it, which was blank. The elders said some of them did, the ones they called the Long Voices. They were the memory keepers. "So either a Long Voice is present," Mitha said, "and recognizes you, or not." "Yes." "And if not?" Vora said nothing. "Right," said Mitha. She put her mug down with the deliberateness again, the decision-making movement. "I want to come." "No." "Vora." "No." She said it without heat, without the sharpness that would have made it an argument. She said it the way the stream went over stone, steady, following the path of least damage, inevitable. "You're 81 years old." "I'm aware of my age." "The passes are." "I'm aware of the passes. I've watched you come back from them twice." Mitha's voice had not risen, but the density of it had changed, all that essential Mitha, compressed further. "I've watched you come back from things for 43 years, and I'm not going to tell you to take me along. I'm asking. There's a difference." The fire had gone out while they were reading. The room was blue with evening. Outside, one of the soldiers was talking quietly to another, and the sound of voices was a low thread in the air. "Mitha," Vora said. "I know." They sat with the silence for a while, and it was not a bad silence, which was a thing that took most people a lifetime to learn how to make. She told Khan in the morning. He received it with the controlled relief of someone who had prepared for a worse answer, and then he outlined the route, the timeline, the support structure his unit would position at the pass approaches. He used the word support carefully, in the way people used words when they meant something they knew was inadequate but had nothing better. "You understand," Vora said, "that if your units are visible from the pass, the Veth will not receive me. They'll receive an accord invocation backed by a military presence, which is a different thing entirely." "I understand." "You need to be below the ridge line, out of sight, out of sound if possible." He nodded. The sergeant, Arith, made a note in the way people made notes when they were thinking about logistics, and also about the very large possibility that the person they were noting things for would not come back. "There's something else," Vora said. Khan looked at her. "The Veth aren't invaders." She said it steadily, watching his face. "I need you to understand that before I walk into those passes, they didn't cross because they wanted your territory. They crossed because something pushed them across, something worse on the other side." Khan's jaw did the thing again, the tightening, the honest tell. He was processing. "You knew this," Vora said. "We suspected it," Arith said from the corner, and Khan didn't contradict her. "The reconnaissance data suggested displacement, not aggression." "If I invoke the Accord," Vora said, "and the Veth recognize it, the conversation I'll be having won't be about them retreating. It'll be about what's behind them." "That's a larger problem than we came here with," Khan said. "Yes. Can the Accord address it?" Vora looked at the table, at the documents, at the foxed, string-bound pages that were 300 years of someone else's work, someone else's careful construction of a bridge between two peoples who had every reason to simply destroy each other. She thought about the Orc elders who'd maintained it. The Greythorn bloodline, generation by generation, carrying the weight of it the way you carried something heavy, not because carrying was easy but because putting it down would be worse. "I don't know," she said. "I'll find out." Mitha made her a pack. She did it the same way she made tea, with complete attention and no drama. Dried meat, hard bread. A waterproof wrap for the documents, because Vora would need them for the specific wording of the invocation. A flask. A change of wool socks, because Mitha had an opinion about wet feet that Vora had long ago stopped arguing with. A small folding knife, not a weapon, just the knife they used to eat with, the one with the carved handle. "I know you're not going to use the knife," Mitha said. "I might need to cut something." "That's what I mean." She handed the pack to Vora at the door of the cottage at the gray hour just before sunrise. The soldiers were breaking camp in the yard, the small sounds of gear being assembled, and the mist was in, and the birch trees were gray shapes in it, and the stream made its constant sound. Vora took the pack. She stood in the doorway for a moment with Mitha standing in front of her, which meant looking down, because there was almost a foot of height between them, and had been for 43 years, and it had never mattered in any way that mattered. Mitha looked up at her with those pale, clear eyes. "Well," Mitha said. "Well," Vora said. "Don't come back stupid," Mitha said, which was the thing she'd said every time Vora had walked away from her into something difficult, for 43 years, and which meant everything that could not be adequately covered by the available words. Vora put her hand briefly on top of Mitha's white-plaited hair. Then she turned and walked down the path toward the soldiers, and the mist, and the gray ridge trail, and the passes. She went alone. Khan's unit positioned themselves below the southern ridge line as agreed, and she climbed above them through the morning, through the zone where the basalt gave way to the older, darker stone of the high passes, where nothing grew except a flat gray lichen that clung to the rock faces in patches that looked, in certain lights, like old maps of territories no one could name anymore. The passes had a sound. She'd known it when she was young, before the war, before the running, a subvocal thrum that wasn't quite wind and wasn't quite the rock itself, but was somewhere in between, the sound of a geological body that had been a border for so long that it had internalized the concept. She felt it through the soles of her boots. She breathed it in with the cold air. She'd been in the passes twice in her adult life. Once at the end of the war, running south, carrying Mitha's wool blanket and nothing else. Once 15 years later, when the itching restlessness of having stayed still too long had driven her north as far as the first high call, where she'd stood and looked at the gray miles of stone going north toward nothing she had a name for, and then turned around and gone back to the valley. She'd told Mitha she'd gone to check on the passes. "You want to feel if you were still yourself," Mitha had said. "Don't do that," Vora had said. Were you? Yes, she'd said, still myself. She went through the first call by mid-morning, the second by noon. The third, which was the old Accord position, the place where the stone carved itself into a natural amphitheater that looked like someone's deliberate design, and wasn't, the third she reached in the early afternoon, when the light came sideways and exhausted the way it did in places where it had been trying to arrive and failing for a long time. She stopped at the edge of the amphitheater. The Veth were already there. There were 6 of them, standing at the northern rim of the amphitheater in the loose, weight-distributed posture of beings built for terrain that didn't favor standard biped locomotion. The drawing Cale had shown her was accurate but insufficient. The drawing had gotten the architecture right and missed the presence. The way they occupied space, which was not the way humans occupied space, and was not the way orcs occupied space either, but was something different, something that registered on a level below vision, a sense that these beings had been here before everything that came after them, and would remain when everything that came after them was gone. Their eyes caught the light, all 6 pairs at once turning toward her. She stood very still. She was aware of being as she'd always been, a thing that was difficult to categorize. Not human, not Veth, the last of a bloodline that had positioned itself for 300 years in the space between, which was not comfortable but was where she was. She took the document out of the waterproof wrap. She didn't need it for the words. She'd memorized them 3 times on the walk up, but she held it because it was the physical evidence of the thing, the written record, the human archive, the proof that someone had thought this worth writing down and keeping. She said the words. Not in Orcish. The Accord's language was neither Orcish nor Veth but the deliberate construction of a third language, built specifically for this purpose, which was the only kind of language treaty could really be, something neither party owned. She'd worked through the pronunciation the night before, in the cottage, with Mitha listening, and Mitha's occasional gentle corrections when her mouth tried to default to familiar shapes. The words went out into the amphitheater, and the amphitheater did what amphitheaters do, which is hold sound. The Veth were still. For a long time. She let the silence happen. She'd been trained in orc silence, which was different from human silence. Human silence was an absence of sound, while orc silence was a thing you inhabited, a texture, a medium through which meaning passed without words. She held the silence and let it work. Then one of the 6 stepped forward. It was taller than the others by a head, and moved in the slightly different way that long-lived things moved, not slower, not less capable, but as if it had developed a relationship with momentum over time that gave it a quality of measured authority. Its skin carried the bioluminescent nodules in clusters that suggested age, because the young ones, she knew from the elders' descriptions, had them scattered and dim, while the old ones had them bright and grouped. These were bright. Long voice. It stood 6 feet from her and looked at her with the widely set eyes that were built for ambush, and used now for something that was not ambush at all. That was the opposite of ambush. That was the sustained, deliberate attention of something deciding whether to receive. Then it spoke. The words were in the Accord language. Vora understood perhaps half of them, which was more than she'd hoped. The structure she understood completely. It was the response formula, the formal acknowledgement, the acceptance of the invocation. The Accord was alive. The Accord was being received. She breathed. She said the next words, the bloodline declaration, the full formal naming of the Greythorn line, 300 years of it, beginning with the founder Keth Greythorn, who had stood in this same amphitheater at the first signing and spoken the same formula she was speaking now, and proceeding through every generation she'd memorized, ending with her own name, which was the last name, after which the line was done. The long voice heard it, all of it. She could see it receiving the names, in the way that something deeply old received a long recitation of history, not as information being processed, but as something being recognized, something being located within an existing structure. When she finished, there was another silence. Then the long voice spoke again, and this time she understood more than half. It was a question, not a challenge, a question, asked with the particular quality of something that has held a concern for a very long time and has not had an appropriate forum to raise it. What drove you from the Greythorn Valley, it said. What ended the bloodline? A war, she said in the Accord language, assembling it carefully from what she'd memorized. A human war. The Orc bloodlines were in its path. Another silence. Not a war against us, she said. A war that had nothing to do with us, that we were simply present for, in the wrong place, in the wrong century. The long voice made a sound that was not a word in the Accord language. It might have been an expression. It might have been a comment. She filed it without interpreting it. Then it said, we were pushed. She said, I know. She said, I need to know by what. They talked for 4 hours. Or rather, they exchanged, which was the closer word. The Accord language was not built for conversation. It was built for formal communication between two kinds of mind that processed reality differently, and what it allowed was more like parallel statements of position than dialogue. You said your thing. You heard their thing. You adjusted your thing based on what you'd heard. Over time, if you were patient, this produced something that worked like understanding. She was patient. What she learned, piece by piece, adjusted and readjusted through the limited medium available to them, was this. The Veth had not come south by choice. The thing that had pushed them was old, older than the Accord, older than the bloodlines, older than the human kingdoms whose ruins they'd passed through in the deep north, which were ruins she hadn't known existed, which meant there had been human civilizations in the far north before anything she'd been taught about. The thing was not alive in the sense she understood alive. It operated on geological time. It was not intelligent in the way she understood intelligent, but it was not mindless either. It was purposive, directional, advancing at a pace that made it easy to not take seriously until it was very close. It ate territory. It converted, which was the closest word she could find in the Accord vocabulary. It changed the nature of the land it moved through. The Veth had been retreating from it for 60 years and had finally run out of north. She said, can it be stopped? The long voice said, in our understanding, no. In our understanding it can be turned, redirected, given a different path. She said, how? The long voice said, the deep passes, the ones that run east. They lead to nothing, stone and ice, and no life at a sufficient depth that if the thing is redirected into them, it will continue in that direction and not reverse. But the deep passes require. It used a word she didn't know, and she asked it to show her, and it made a gesture that meant something in the Veth's own language that she translated, approximately, as a guide who knows both the approach and the interior. Someone built for both. She looked at her hands. The bark-dark skin, the knuckles, the Greythorn hands that were not quite human and not quite Veth, but were the hands of something that had stood in the space between for 300 years. Built for both, she said. The long voice held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, it said. She went back down in the early evening. Khan was waiting at the ridge line, exactly where she'd left him, and he had the controlled stillness of someone who had spent several hours not moving and was very practiced at it. He looked at her face, not her face, exactly, her expression, and she watched him parse it. Well, he said. Sit down, she said. He sat on a flat rock. She sat on the ground, which she preferred, and she told him everything. Arith appeared at his shoulder partway through and listened without interrupting, and Kale materialized from somewhere behind and sat cross-legged in the dirt with his notebook open and his pen moving. When she was done, Khan was quiet for a long moment. You're telling me, he said carefully, that the Veth aren't the problem. They're the symptom. Yes. and the problem is older than anything in our records. Apparently. And the solution requires you to guide the thing into the deep eastern passes, she said it flatly. Yes. With the Veth. With the long voice. One of them. The others can't operate in the deep passes, the architecture doesn't suit them, but the long voice is old enough that it's developed adaptations. She paused. And I'm the only one who can run the Accord language during the operation, which is how we keep the thing from registering us as separate presences and splitting to address both. Khan looked at his hands. He had the expression of someone doing structural calculations on something they'd been told was load-bearing, and were not sure they believed. How long, he asked. 3 days, maybe 4. You'll be in the deep passes for 3 or 4 days. Yes. With a Veth. With a long voice, yes. He looked at her. Is there any chance I'm going to talk you out of this? No, she said. I didn't think so. He rubbed his face with both hands, a very human gesture she'd always thought, the pressing of your palms against your own face as if trying to manually reset something. Then he looked up. What do you need from us? Stay out of the passes entirely. Both ranges. Any movement north of the southern call will be detected and will complicate things significantly. All right. And she paused. There's a cottage in the valley below, woman named Mitha. We saw it on the way in. Make sure she stopped. Make sure she has what she needs. Khan looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said, of course. She spent 1 night on the surface, before she went back into the passes with the long voice. Khan had the good sense not to argue about the logistics of it. He gave her a tent, a meal, and approximately 3 hours of interrogation from Kale, who had a scholar's specific hunger for primary sources, and was barely containing his excitement about a living speaker of the Accord language, however imperfect, and kept asking her to say things aloud so he could note the phonology. I'm not a museum exhibit, she told him. Of course not. Could you say that last phrase again? The one about the third-generation signatories. The vowels in the middle register are. She said it again. She was tired, and Kale's enthusiasm was the kind that was hard to refuse because it came from a place of genuine love for the thing itself, not the spectacle of it. She'd known a few Orc scholars like that before the war. The ones who loved the histories because the histories were beautiful, not because they were useful. Arith brought her a cup of tea at some point. Not Mitha's tea. The wrong leaves and steeped too long, but hot and offered without commentary, which was the best kind of generosity. The night was cold and clear, which was the pass's way of being beautiful. She lay in the tent and did not sleep and listened to the geological thrum of the stone, which was her companion in this as in everything, and thought about what the long voice had told her and what it hadn't, and what the space between those two things contained. The Veth had been retreating for 60 years. She tried to hold that number, 60 years of movement, 60 years of knowing what was behind you was worse than what was in front, 60 years of not being able to explain it to anyone who didn't already know, because the thing that was behind them was not a thing that fit into the vocabulary of anyone who hadn't seen it. She knew something about that. The retreating. The thing behind you that no one else's vocabulary could hold. She thought about the Greythorn bloodline. 300 years of it, carrying the Accord the way you carried something that was heavy and necessary, not for love of it exactly, but because love wasn't the right word for what you felt about a responsibility you were born into. The right word was closer to inheritance. It was what you were made of, and you could put it down or you could be what it made you. She'd spent 43 years in a valley without a name telling herself it was down, that she'd put it down, that the bloodline was finished and so were its obligations, and the valley was enough. Mitha had never contradicted her. Mitha had made tea and read her books and let the years go, and had never once said the thing that Vora suspected she'd always known, which was that you can choose to live as if something is finished, but the thing itself doesn't take instruction from your choices. Carrot Caballo, horseface. The name in Vora's own language for the thing she was, not an insult exactly in the original, but the name for the orc lineage that had the particular bone structure around the jaw and brow, the jutting, the old-world face that made humans step back, that made children stare, that had made even the other orc bloodlines look at the gray mental branch with a specific sideways quality for as long as anyone could remember. The face that nobody missed when the bloodline ended, except Mitha, who had never once looked at it as anything other than the face of the person she loved. It had been Mitha who, in the early years, when the farmers at the cold-break market looked at Vora and flinched, had moved through those reactions like a woman moving through inconvenient weather, not ignoring them exactly, but refusing to grant them structural significance. She'd done it not with words, not with the grand gesture of someone staging a demonstration, but with the quiet, consistent fact of her own position, which was, "This is who I am with. This is the person. Whatever you do with your face about it is your business." She'd never stopped doing it, not once in 43 years. The consistency of it, the absolute unbroken practice of it, was one of the things Vora had come to understand as a form of extraordinary courage. Not the dramatic kind, but the kind that just kept showing up, every market day, every year, until the market itself eventually adjusted. Some of them had. Most of the younger traders now just nodded at Vora with the particular nod of someone who has decided that something is normal. It was not warmth, it was not friendship, but it was an acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was enough. Vora had learned to receive acknowledgement with the same equanimity Mitha used for everything, as sufficient, as what was available, as a reasonable thing to go on with. She fell asleep somewhere in the middle of this thought, which was not where she'd intended to be when she reached the end of it, and woke 3 hours later to the pre-dawn gray with her mind quiet and her body ready. She went to find the long voice. The deep passes were a different world. She'd known the upper passes, the gray basalt, the flat lichen, the thrum of geological border. The deep passes were below this, accessed through a slot in the eastern wall of the amphitheater that looked like nothing from the outside, and opened into a descending corridor of such profound cold that she felt it as pressure rather than temperature, a thing that pushed against her rather than simply surrounding her. The long voice moved through it without apparent difficulty. It moved the way she imagined something moved when it had been alive long enough to have stopped finding terrain surprising. She watched it navigate the narrow sections, its body adjusting, the bioluminescent nodules under its jaw catching the slight phosphorescence that came up from the deep stone walls, giving off a blue-green quality of light that was not quite enough to see by, but was more than nothing. She followed it by sound and by the specific quality of cold air moving toward them, which came from the direction they needed to go. She moved through it the way she moved through everything, steadily, paying attention, adapting. They communicated in fragments of the Accord language stripped to essentials. She said direction, it said slightly east. She said duration. It said, when you feel the ground change, stop. The second day of the deep passes was the hardest one. The cold by then had moved past her skin into the muscles and into the places between the bones, and her body was using energy-maintaining temperature that she'd planned on using for other things. And the darkness was the specific darkness of deep rock that had never had light in it, which was different from ordinary darkness. Ordinary darkness was made of shadows, which meant it was made of things that had light and had lost it, while this was the original condition, darkness that had never been anything else, which had a different quality, a presence. She counted her steps for a while. She stopped when she reached 10,000 and the counting had served its purpose, which was to establish that her mind was still organized and sequential, that she was still herself in the specific way she always checked for, the Mitha check. She'd started thinking of it, the interior question of whether she would recognize herself from the outside. The long voice stopped. She stopped behind it. It said in the Accord language, the one you call a scholar, he wants to understand us. This is unusual. She considered how to answer this. He wants to understand everything, she said. It's his nature. It said, is it common in humans, this wanting? The wanting is common, she said. The object varies. A silence that had the quality of consideration. Then, in our remembering, the long voices hold our remembering the way your documents hold your remembering. There were Orc scholars, too, before the war. Yes, she said. What happened to them? The cold, the darkness, her own voice very quiet. What happened to everyone? The long voice made no sound for a moment. She could see its bioluminescent nodules from behind. They shifted slightly with something that might have been a breath, the blue-green light pulsing once and steadying. We have held you in our remembering, it said. The Greythorn bloodline, all of them. We could not stop holding them, even when we had no way to speak of them. She put her hand against the cold stone wall and let the cold of it run up through her palm and her wrist. I know, she said. I know you did. They stayed in the dark for a moment with that between them, which was not comfortable and was not meant to be comfortable but was adequate, and then the long voice said, farther east, and she followed it. The ground changed on the second day. It was not a change she could have described to anyone afterward, because it was not a visual or auditory or even purely tactile thing. It was a change in the nature of what the ground was doing, as if the stone had a direction, an intention, a slow, purposive lean that was not the normal lean of geology. She stopped walking. The long voice stopped beside her. It said, yes, here. What followed was not something she would later narrate in sequence, because sequence was inadequate to it. It was a sustained engagement with something vast and non-responsive and purposive, and what she and the long voice did was not fight it. They could not have fought it any more than they could have fought a river with their hands, but they did something more precise and less dramatic, which was position themselves correctly, and use the specific qualities of the accord language to present a different direction as a preferred option. The accord language was built for beings who processed reality differently. It was built to create a shared frame that neither party fully owned. When she'd learned this as a thing she'd memorized for invocation purposes, she'd understood it abstractly. When she used it now, standing in the deep cold with the long voice beside her, and something vast and geological pressing against the walls of her understanding, she understood it in the bones. She said the words. The long voice harmonized them. That was the nearest description, harmonize, in the sense that it added something to what she said that changed the resonance. Together, the words became something that was neither Orc nor Veth, but was the specific third thing that the accord had been built to produce. The thing considered. She stood in the deep cold and held herself very still and let it consider, and she did not panic, because panic was a response that made sense when the threat had a pace you could outrun, and this did not have a pace she could outrun, and the only available response was to be very still and very present, and to continue to hold the frame she was offering as a better option. The ground changed again. Different this time. The lean shifted. The purposive direction, that slow geological intention, oriented differently, east and down, not north and south, not toward the light and the valleys and the human settlements below. She breathed. They held it for an hour, maybe more. Time was operating differently in the deep passes, which had something to do with the cold and something to do with the thing itself, which existed on a scale where an hour was not a meaningful unit. When the long voice finally said, "Done," its voice was different, quieter. She recognized the quality of something that had been very extended and was now recovering. She said, "Are you certain?" It said, "Nothing in our experience is certain, but yes." They came out of the deep passes on the morning of the fourth day. The light hit her like something physical she'd forgotten in the gray cold below, that light had weight, that it arrived with pressure, that her skin had an opinion about it. She stood at the slot in the eastern amphitheater wall, and breathed it in and let her eyes adjust. The long voice stopped beside her. They stood for a moment in the threshold between the deep and the surface, between what they'd done and whatever came next. She said in the Accord language, "The Veth, can they, will they stay?" It said, "In the Southern Territories." She heard the complex shape of the question it was answering, which was not the question she'd asked but was the real one underneath it. We have nowhere to go back to. We are here. Where here is, that question is not fully answered. The hegemony will want a settlement, she said. An agreement, territory, defined lines. It said, we understand lines. We understand agreements. She heard underneath this, we are not what your kind fears. We are what your kind does not know. These are different conditions. One can be addressed. I know, she said, I'll tell them. The long voice made the expression sound again, the one she'd been unable to interpret in their first exchange in the amphitheater. She'd had 4 days now to learn its repertoire, and she thought she understood it better. It wasn't a comment exactly. It was the sound of something finding a situation adequate. Not good. Not ideal, just adequate. This will work. This is sufficient. She thought about Mitha, who had a version of that sound. A specific small exhalation that meant, this is sufficient. This is enough to go on with. She had learned so much of her emotional vocabulary from that small human woman in a valley that had no name on any map. She thought about this, standing in the threshold, and then she shouldered her pack and started down the slope toward the southern ridge. Khan was where she'd left him. Of course he was. He saw her coming down the slope, and he stood up from the flat rock, and he had the expression of someone who had decided, at some point in the last 4 days, that he was going to receive whatever outcome arrived with equanimity, and was now receiving a better outcome than he'd prepared for, and was trying not to let his face do too much about it. Well, he said. The Eastern Passes, she said. It's in the Eastern Passes. It'll stay there if we don't disturb them. And the Veths need a conversation, a real one. She stopped in front of him. She was exhausted in a way that went past the body into something deeper, not damage exactly, but the specific depletion of something that had been used for its full intended purpose for the first time. They're not going back north. There's nothing to go back to. He was quiet for a moment. That's a political problem, he said. Yes, she said, it is. You should probably start working on it. He looked at her and then at the ridge above her, which was empty of the long voice now. It had gone back through the amphitheater to rejoin the others. Did it work, really? For now, she said, yes, for our lifetimes probably. After that, she shrugged, which was a very Mitha gesture, she was aware. After that, it's someone else's problem. It always is. He nodded. He turned to Areth and said something about breaking camp, about the communication back to command, about the Accord documents and Kale's notes, which were apparently extensive, and were going to be extremely important to a large number of people who were going to be very surprised by their contents. She let him do it. She sat down on the flat rock he'd vacated, and she was very still for a moment. And she was aware of the precise and complete silence of someone who has done the thing that was required and is now just existing in the aftermath of it, which is not triumph exactly, but is its own specific and sufficient thing. Then she stood up and started down the ridge toward the valley. The mist was in when she got back, which felt correct. The birch trees were gray shapes in it. The stream made its sound. The cottage windows were lit, which meant Mitha was up, which meant Mitha had not slept properly in 4 days, which was not surprising. Vora walked up the path. The door opened before she reached it. Mitha stood in the doorway in her wool dressing gown with her white hair loose, which she almost never wore loose, and her expression was the one she used when she was feeling a great deal, and had decided to feel it quietly. She looked at Vora, all of her, the face, the hands, the pack, the eyes, with the thoroughness of someone doing inventory on something they value. Well, Mitha said. Well, Vora said. They stood in the doorway for a moment. which was a thing they'd done many times at the beginning and the end of many things, and Vora felt the 43 years of it settle around her like the specific weight of something that has been present for so long it has become part of the structure of the day. "Come in," Mitha said. "I've kept the porridge warm." Vora came in. She set her pack down by the door. She sat in her chair, which had the shape of her in it, and she let the room close around her, the rugs, the mugs, the herbs, the smell of Mitha's specific long inhabitation of this specific space. "Did you come back stupid?" Mitha asked. Vora considered this. "No," she said. "I came back differently than I left." Mitha handed her a bowl of porridge. She sat in her own chair. For a while there was just the sound of the fire, which was going now, and the stream, and the mist at the windows. "The soldiers said they'd be back," Mitha said, "for the formal accord documentation, whatever that means." "It means they're going to want me to sit in rooms and talk to people for a long time," Vora said. I know. It's important, presumably." "Presumably." Mitha was quiet for a moment. "The Veth," she said, "will they?" "They'll be all right," Vora said. "It'll take time, a lot of time. It won't be clean." She thought of the long voice standing at the threshold between the deep and the surface, the expression sound of adequate, but it'll be something. Mitha nodded. She had the look she had when she was filing information away and would revisit it later, probably at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, which was when she did her best processing. "And the thing in the passes." "East," Vora said, "and down for our lifetimes probably. And after, someone else's problem." Mitha made the sound, the small exhalation, the adequate. "This will work. This is enough to go on with." "All right," she said. They sat in the chairs that had their shapes in them, by the fire, in the cottage at the end of a valley with no name, in the mist and the birch trees and the sound of the stream, which had been running for longer than the war, longer than the accord, longer than the bloodlines, longer than any of the things that had seemed so permanent and turned out to be provisional. And Vora thought about what it meant to be the last of something and still be sitting here. Still here, still enough, the stream still running, Mitha still drinking tea. She ate her porridge and let the warmth of the fire do its work. And outside the mist held the birch trees in their gray morning shapes, and the valley had no name, and that was still exactly right.